first question I want to ask is a question that I think gets to the heart of why we are here and where we are going. This is the question. The question is, are you on a happiness quest or a truth quest?
Both. Okay, would be on both.
Both. What happens if it seems like these two conflict? If you've got happiness, perceived happiness on one hand, but truth is over here. I think many in our country and many in the church are on a happiness quest. Truth, back seat. In fact, a survey done not long ago, only about 16% of people in the United States make their moral decisions based on what the Bible says. Moral decisions. The vast majority, or at least plurality, decide they're going to do it based on either what's right for them or what feels right. Now, of course, our founding document says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men were created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What would it be, or let me put it another way, what if the pursuit of happiness could only be attained, or happiness could only be attained, if you pursued truth? In other words, can you have ultimate happiness apart from the truth? Oh, you could have short-term well-being, of course, being divorced from the truth, but long-term, can you have happiness without truth? And what do we mean by happiness? What we're going to get into today is the issue of truth, one of the most basic issues of all. And Jesus, when he was talking to the woman at the well, said, God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth. So of all the attributes we're going to talk about, truth is what we're going to talk about today. And as we mentioned last time, and every time we start this presentation, we talk about these attributes of God. These attributes here are attributes that only God has. Only he is eternal. Only he is all-powerful. Only he is all-knowing. Only he is everywhere present and unchangeable and self-existent and simple spirit. These are attributes only he has. He can't communicate to us. But there are attributes that he has that he can share with us. Holiness, beauty, truth, the one we're going to talk about today, justice, love, and mercy. And there's some others as well, but these are the main ones we're talking about. Today we're going to talk about truth. Truth, an attribute of God. Here's our mission. First thing we're going to talk about what is truth and how does it relate to God? In fact, Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? When Jesus was standing before him. Then we're going to talk about, isn't truth relative? Because in our culture today, right, truth is relative. Whatever you decide is true. You got your truth, I got my truth. It's true for you, but not for me. All truth is relative. You've heard these claims. So we have to deal with that. Then we're going to talk about what is humanity's greatest problem. It's not war. It's not disease. But it's related to this issue of truth. And then finally, if God is truth, how should we live? That's kind of the application. What are we going to do with this stuff? Just because we know God is truth, what does that mean? All right? So let's start here at point one. What is truth and how does it relate to God? And let's go to John chapter 18. Here is Pilate and Jesus. Pilate is questioning Jesus, and they're having a discussion. And in John chapter 18, Pilate says, so you are a king then, because Jesus mentioned the kingdom. And then Jesus answered, you are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. This is why I came into the world. This is why. To testify to truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And then, of course, Pilate said, what is truth? Now, what did Pilate say right after that? Right after he asked the rhetorical question, what is truth? What did he do? He went out and he said, I find no fault in this man. He uttered a truth claim, didn't he? He basically said Jesus was innocent. So here he is asking the question, what is truth? And then he answers his own question by saying Jesus is innocent. He basically told it like it was. Jesus was innocent. He found no fault in this man. But notice, Jesus comes to testify to the truth. That's why he came into the world. Do we do that? Do we testify to the truth? Truth is telling it like it is. Right? If I say here we are in North Carolina right now, that's telling it like it is. If I say here we are in Phoenix, where I'll be later this week, that wouldn't be telling it like it is. Or we might say truth is what corresponds to reality. Or truth is what corresponds to its referent. If I say this is a black Bible, that would be true. If I say it's a white Quran, that wouldn't be true. You say, well, this is so obvious. Why are we starting here? Because in today's culture, our first duty is to state the obvious. There's people who deny and there's truth out there. So we've got to define our terms. Here's an actual dictionary definition of the truth. Check this out. Truth is fidelity to an original or to a standard. Truth is fidelity to an original or to a standard. Now, when Jesus says, I am the truth, what's he saying? He is congruent with the original. That he is just like the original. He's an exact copy of the original. And that's exactly what the writer of Hebrews says. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Christ represents God in the flesh. Now, as you know, Jesus has two natures. He has a divine nature and a human nature. And in his human nature, he's a man, but he's a sinless man. And in his divine nature, he's the second person of the eternal Trinity. But his behavior represents God. He is just, he is righteous, he is loving. He has all the attributes of God, the ones that God can share in his human nature. And in the ones that he can't share, Jesus has them in his divine nature because he is a divine being. Jesus also said, as you know, the famous quote, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. By the way, that's not an arbitrary claim. Jesus said that because God is infinitely just, which we'll talk about next week, but he's also infinitely loving. What's the problem? Well, we'll talk about it next week. God's kind of caught in a little bit of a dilemma because he's just and loving, and he sees unjust creatures that he loves. What does he do? We'll get to it next week. Also, the Bible is the truth. Jesus says, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. So Jesus represents the truth in a being, and the Bible represents God's truth in a book. And the way we get sanctified, the way we get more and more like Christ, is through the Word and the Spirit, of course. We have to know the Word. The Word needs to change us. If you seek the truth, you will find Christ. Here's what Jesus said. In fact, I was at University of Maryland a few weeks ago, and afterwards, in fact, I'll mention this later too, I was talking to a bunch of atheists afterwards, and I was just asking them, hey, have you ever read the Bible? Oh, yeah, a long time ago. Yeah, I looked at it. Have you ever read the Gospel of John? You could tell they really hadn't. You know, they just didn't want it. They didn't want it to be true, so they're not even going to look at it. Well, look what Jesus says here in John chapter 7. He says, my teaching is not my own. It comes from him who sent me. If anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. He who speaks on his own does so to gain honor for himself, but he who works for the honor of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Now notice he says, if anyone chooses to do God's will, he will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. I said to these atheists in Maryland, I said, now look, I don't care where you're coming from, but you owe it to yourself as an intelligent human being to at least investigate for yourself this character, Jesus. I mean, you got to admit, this is a unique character in all of history. Whether he's God or not, well, that's another question. I obviously think the evidence is quite good he is, but let's just set that aside. Just as a man, just look at this guy, read the testimony about him, and make a decision. You can't call yourself an honest intellectual if you disregard one of the most, probably, literally, the most influential person in all of history. If you're just going to poo-poo him and put him off to the side and not really take a firm look at him. You got to take a fair look at this guy, and this is what Jesus is saying here. You're going to find out. If you're really seeking God, you're going to find out who I am. You're going to seek the truth. And if you seek the truth, you will find the truth. Jesus also said that the truth would do what? In the next chapter. This is very common. We all know this phrase. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Here's what he says to the Jews who had believed in him. Jesus said, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, how's it going to set you free? Well, there's a number of ways it can set you free, but the biggest way it's going to set you free is free of the consequences of your own sin. That's what it's going to set you free of. In eternity. Now, you're going to sin now and have consequences on this earth. And just because you believe in Jesus doesn't mean those consequences are going to go away. But you're going to have peace with God, as Paul says in Romans chapter 5. You're going to have peace with God because he has already paid the price. You're going to be free from the consequences there. Now, a few verses later in John chapter 8, remember, he's talking to Jews who believed in him. A few verses later, here's what he says about the devil. He says, you, and he's talking to these Jews, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. How many times you heard, well, Jesus, he never said a bad word about anyone. Imagine you're having a conversation with some people and you say to them, your father's the devil. And there's no truth in him, and therefore there's no truth in you. You think he was just kind of a sweet Mr. Rogers type guy? No, he's calling people on the carpet. And there's no truth in Satan. And who is the prince of the world? According to the Bible? Satan, right? Jesus is calling him out, saying there's no truth in him. Now, John, who wrote this book, also wrote a little epistle called 1 John. And in 1 John, he gives us a warning. 1 John chapter 2, here's what he says. Do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the cravings of sinful man, the lust of the eyes, and the boasting of what he has and does, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but the man who does the will of God lives forever. Now, when you think of the world, what do you think of? What do you think of? Possessions. There's all sorts of stuff out there, right? That's the world. Is that what John's talking about here? You notice where he says the world is? The world's in here. The world is the cravings of sinful man. In fact, the New American Standard says the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life. Well, that's us, isn't it? I mean, there are things out there we want, right? But that causes us to lust. Lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life. When you think about it, that's our problem. We're the problem. What we see and feel and our pride, that's what gets us into trouble. We want these things, and they sometimes cause us to pursue happiness instead of truth. Now, you say, okay, so Jesus is the truth, but how is truth connected back to God? Jesus says, I am the truth. Well, how is that connected back to God? Now, I'm a visual person, so I like to have visual aids try and help me think about this, and I don't know if this aid will work for you, but it works for me. We've been using this prism to demonstrate that God is one, but there are different attributes that we see about God. And despite the fact that God is one, we see these attributes. We see that he is just, and then we see he's loving, and then we see he's all-knowing, and then we see he's eternal. We see all these attributes separately, but in God they're one, right? Just like you have one light coming into a prism, and then you get all these different colored lights coming out. Now, God is the source of all truth. And the way we know God is we know God by his effects. We don't know God directly, at least not through our senses directly, because God is not a sensual being in that sense, right? You can't see him, you can't feel him, can't touch him, can't hear him. You know, he's not a being that is in space and time in that sense. So how do we know God exists? We know him by his effects. These are some of the effects of God. And this is even what the Bible teaches. For example, creation is an effect of God. The heavens declare the glory of God. In Romans chapter 1, Paul says what? That the creation is evidence of God. And in fact, we'll see the verse here a little bit later. The laws of logic are evidence of God. The fact that we can reason, the fact that we have a mind, the fact that we can think shows there must be a great mind there. Why can we think? Why can we even reason? Why can we even understand one another? How does that happen if we're in a chaotic world, a chaos world where there's no orderer? Think about this. You wouldn't even know what order was, or you wouldn't even know what random was unless you knew what order was, right? And there'd be no order unless somebody ordered it. The world is orderly. We can do science. Why? Because the world is orderly, and we can depend on cause and effect. That's the very reason we can do science is because the world is orderly. Morality comes from God, right and wrong. Paul teaches this in Romans chapter 2. The Gentiles who do not have the law written where? On their hearts. Even though they don't have the Bible, they know basic right and from wrong. Everyone knows that. The laws of nature, I already mentioned that. Miracles, they're effects of God. If miracles have occurred, they're effects of God. And of course, Christ is an effect of God. Now, how can we discover God and these effects? We discover God's effects by philosophy. Now, this sounds like a highfalutin word, but it really isn't, because we're using philosophy right now. Part of philosophy are the laws of logic, the immaterial realities that we all know, the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics, the laws of reason, the law of causality, that every effect has a cause. These are self-evident, intuitive principles. And, of course, morality. You just know that torturing babies for fun is wrong. You don't need to get any evidence for that. You just know it. It's called what philosophers call a properly basic claim. You just know it. It's part of being a human being. Now, you can suppress it, you can deny it, but in your heart you know it's true. Why? Because it's put there by God. And then we've got the natural sciences like physics, biology, and chemistry. We can learn about the effects of, say, creation by those principles. Now, there's something we're leaving out here. How else do we know God? There's one other discipline that we haven't listed here. How else do we know God? Other than philosophy, which is intuitive, much of it's intuitive, not all of it. Other than the natural sciences, there's one other thing we're leaving out. What? History, right? History is another way we get effects from God. We have archaeology, we have physical evidence, we have written and oral testimony. That's the Bible right there. This is a historical document that tells us what has happened in history, enough information to know how to get saved. That's what the main focus of the document is, how to get saved and sanctified. Can't tell you everything about history. No book could. But it tells you enough to know that you're a sinner and that you need to get saved and sanctified. Now, many in our culture today erroneously try and say that the natural sciences are all you need to know. In fact, we get all our truth from science. Can you get all your truth from science? No, of course not. In fact, you can't do science without philosophy, right? You can't do science without the laws of logic. You can't do science without the law of causality. Science presupposes the law of causality, right? When you're doing science, you're trying to figure out what particular effect was caused by a particular cause. How did this effect come into being? Well, there's a cause. Well, who did it, right? That's what you're doing when you're doing science. You can't do science without philosophy. In fact, everybody who gets a PhD in physics, biology, and chemistry, what does the PH in PhD stand for? Philosophy. That's what it is. It's philosophy of biology, philosophy of physics, philosophy of chemistry, whatever it is. Philosophy. We've talked about this before, that science doesn't say anything scientists do. What does that mean? All data needs to be interpreted. And how do you interpret the data? A lot of times it's based on your philosophical outlook, your worldview. And the debate between, see, a lot of Christians are afraid of science. Oh, you know, we've evolved, and that's what science is. No, science doesn't say that. Science doesn't say anything. Scientists say that. Some of them do. Well, how do you know they're right? Well, you got to look at the evidence and make a decision for yourself. Does the evidence line up with their conclusion? Well, it might or might not. I don't think it does. I mean, certainly evolution is true to a certain extent, microevolution, but not macroevolution. You have to look at the evidence. All data needs to be interpreted. And quite frequently, the atheism of the science has already determined what their conclusion will be when they look at the physical evidence. It's got to be a natural cause. Why? Because we only believe in natural causes. We don't allow intelligent causes into the picture. Well, if you're going to rule out the only other possibility to natural causes, obviously you're always going to come up with a natural cause. Who's saying that? The data's not saying that. You are. You're saying that. So the point here is to say that if God were to go away, there wouldn't be any truth. There wouldn't be anything. There'd be nothing. Nothing would exist. But God is the ultimate source of all truth. So when Jesus says he's the truth, and when the Bible says he created all things, this is Jesus right here. He's done all this. He is the creator. In fact, the scripture, we talked about it before. He's created all things. Jesus has created all this. That's what Colossians 1 says, or Colossians 2. It's Colossians 1, actually. If God were to go away, everything would go into existence. This is one reason, as we talked about last time, that God can't lie or change his mind. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. He, who is the glory of Israel, does not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man that he should change his mind. He is the standard, the unchangeable standard. If he would go out of existence, there'd be nothing. All right, let's go to isn't truth relative? And here are the Maryland students, okay? This is after the event. This was a last-minute event. We only got a room for 100, but we had 100 in there. And I don't know if you can see that really well, but I'm standing over here, and this is their lead atheist, the head of the Atheist Club. His name is Micah. These are all atheists here. There's a couple guys here who are believers. And, yeah, Micah. I said, you're a prophet. I said, what are you doing being an atheist? You know, come on. Anyway, so the lecture was an hour and a half. The questions went on for 2 hours. So this is 3.5 hours into this thing. We're just about to end it. I'm writing on the board. They're asking me questions, so I'm writing stuff on the board. I'm standing over here. And they're trying to say that is truth, or they're trying to say truth is just a human construct. What does that mean? That basically truth is relative, that we just make truth up. It's just in our minds and we just make it up. Okay? So here's the question I asked them. Here's the question I asked them. If truth is just a human construct, I asked them, before there were any human minds on the earth, was this statement true? There are no human minds on the earth. What did they have to say? Well, yes. So what does that mean then? That truth is not a human construct. Because where there are no humans, the statement there are no humans is still true. So where is truth grounded then? It's grounded in something eternal, something unchanging. That's what we mean by God. Now, you hear this all the time, that truth is relative. Actually, truth is absolute. Something that is true for all persons at all times in all places. There are no relative truths. You say, well, I can think of a relative truth. Like what? Well, today it was actually pretty warm here. And I felt warm, but I'm sure the people in Alaska, they felt cold. That's relative. No, it's not relative at all. Why? It's absolutely true for all people at all times in all places that when referring to you today, remember, truth is what corresponds to its referent. If in referring to you today, you felt warm and you really did felt warm, that would be true for all people at all times in all places. And it's absolutely true for all people at all times in all places that when referring to the people in Alaska today, they felt cold. That's just true. Now, when you say all truth is absolute, people will claim that you are very judgmental. In fact, they're going to say things like this: there is no truth. Or they might say you can't know truth. Or they might say all truth is relative. Or my favorite one is this: it's true for you but not for me. You've heard this, right? It happens all the time. People say this to you all the time. It's true for you but not for me. Christianity is true for you. Buddhism is true for me, right? Okay. Or they might say no one has the truth. Or if they really get annoyed with you, then you know what they might say? They might say, you know what? You just ought not judge. They're going to come back at you with that, especially if you're a Christian. And they'll say, Jesus said don't judge. Why are you judging, you hypocrite? Anyway. Now, of course, if there is no truth, then the Bible can't be true, right? Of course, if there is no truth, then any book written by an atheist can't be true either. That's what we're getting to. Hang on. That's exactly what we're getting to. You can already see the problem with it. And in fact, the problem with these claims is that they all violate what's called the law of non-contradiction, one of the laws of logic. They don't meet their own standard. And if you don't learn anything else from what we talk about here tonight, if you learn this one tactic that we're going to talk about in the next 5 minutes, you're going to become a fearless defender of Christianity. Why? Because half of the objections to Christianity, at least half, are all self-defeating, what we call self-defeating. They don't meet the law of non-contradiction. They don't meet their own standard. Let me show you what I mean. Here's your greatest tool in answering these claims. What you do is you apply the claim to itself. Apply the claim to itself. So let me give you an example. If somebody were to walk in here and say, I can't speak a word in English, what would you say to him? Didn't you just say that in English? Everybody can see that's a self-defeating statement, right? It's like saying there are no sentences in the English language longer than 3 words. So wait, man, that was like at least 12, or whatever you said, you know? That doesn't meet its own standard. Or it's like saying my parents had no kids that lived. Or my brother is an only child. Or everything I say is a lie. Some of you will get that tomorrow. Or all generalizations are false. Some of you will never get that one. All right. The point here is this is a self-defeating statement. I can't speak a word in English. And every one of the other ones I just put up there are self-defeating. They can't be true. They violate the law of non-contradiction. So let's do what we call the Roadrunner tactic. What's the Roadrunner tactic? The Roadrunner tactic here in the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, is when we turn a claim on itself. Why? Because it reminds us of Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner. What's Wile E. Coyote's only mission in life? Catch the Roadrunner and eat him, right? But you know Roadrunner is just about to be caught by Coyote, but what happens? He stops short of the cliff, Coyote goes blowing by him, and for a split second he's hanging in midair until he realizes what? He's got no ground to stand on, and he plummets to the valley floor in a heap. That's exactly what you can do to people who utter self-defeating statements. You can show them their argument is no ground below it. It's false. Can't be true. There's no foundation to it. So if someone ever says there is no truth, you should ask them one question. What's the question? Yeah, simply ask the question, hey, is that true? Is it true that there is no truth? Because if it's true that there is no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true. But it claims to be true. See? It violates itself. Now, with this one little tactic, you look like a super genius. See how easy that is? You just turn the claim on itself. How about this one? You hear this all the time. There's no such thing as absolute truth. What do you say to somebody who says that? Yeah, you could say, is that an absolute truth? Or if you want to have some fun, you can say, hey, are you absolutely sure? See? Because that is an absolute truth claim right there, isn't it? It doesn't meet its own standard. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. And with this one little tactic, you look like a super genius. How about this one? This is my favorite. It's true for you, but not for me. How do you answer that? This one is a little bit more subtle, but it is also self-defeating. If somebody says it's true for you, but not for me, say, hey, is that true for everybody? It's true for you, but not for me, true for everybody? Because it's true for you, but not for me, it's true for everybody. Then true for you, but not for me can't be true because it's true for everybody. I know that can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough. But that's because it's self-defeating. It does not meet its own standard. Actually, there's a more fun way of dealing with this. If somebody says it's true for you, but not for me, say, sure, go try that with your bank teller. Yeah, go to your bank teller one day and say, look, the economy's down, I need some extra money. Give me $100,000 out of my account. Bank teller looks at your account and says, I'm sorry, I only have $47.16 in your account. Very easy to get the money. You simply say, that's true for you, but not for me. Give me the $100,000. You going to get the money? No, if it's true, there's only $47.16 in your account. That's true for all people, at all times, in all places, when referring to your account at that time. It's just true. That's just the way things are. By the way, I go to a lot of churches and I ask people, do you believe this book is true? And most people will say, well, yes. And then I'll ask them why. Do you know what answer I get more than any other? Because I have faith. Is that a good answer? Because I have faith. Does your faith change whether or not this book is true? No. Either the book is true or it's not, regardless of what you believe in it. Either God exists and Jesus rose from the dead or not, regardless of what you believe about it. You say, why is the Bible always talking about faith? Because there's two kinds of faith. There's belief that and belief in. We've talked about this before, right? Belief that is getting evidence that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Bible is true. That's intellectual. That's apologetics. That's what we're doing here. We're giving evidence. But all the belief that in the world won't get you saved, according to Christian theology. James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote the book of James, says, even the demons believe that God exists, but they tremble. Why? They know intellectually God exists, but they don't trust in him. See, to be saved, you got to go from belief that to belief in. And that's a matter of the heart, not just the head. And God will not force any person into heaven against that person's will. If you don't want God now, you're not going to want him in eternity. So most of the time when the Bible's talking about faith, it's not talking about belief that. It's talking about belief in. Once you know that it's true, then trust in. How about this one? You hear this a lot. You can't know truth. Somebody says you can't know truth. What should you say to them? Yeah, then how do you know that's true? You see that? That is a truth claim. It's self-defeating to say you can't know truth. Or sometimes it's said this way, you should doubt everything. What should you say to somebody who says that? You should doubt everything. Hey, should I doubt that? Yeah. I mean, why are skeptics skeptical of everything but skepticism? You notice that? Now, by the way, how many people in here sometimes doubt that Christianity is true? Hey, I doubt it sometimes. Come on, be honest. Sometimes you wake up and you go, I don't even know if it's true. In fact, a friend of mine who does seminars like this says, before my first cup of coffee in the morning, I'm an atheist. Right? He doesn't believe in God at all. He's just having a bad day, right? He hasn't gotten his charge yet of caffeine, whatever.
What makes you doubt?
Well, let me just tell you, sometimes I doubt, but mostly it's for emotional reasons. You know, maybe I'm just having a bad day. Or maybe I see something and I go, why would God allow that to happen? That kind of thing, right? So I start thinking, and I realize that the evidence for Christianity is quite good. In fact, I have a whole book on it, right? I think the evidence is quite good. But some days I'm up here. Hey, everything's fine. Some days, emotionally, I'm down here. Well, have the facts changed? Has the evidence changed? No. What's changed? I've changed. Some days are good. Some days are bad. So I realize that when I'm doubting, my doubts are emotional. They're not intellectual. So I realize I ought to start doubting my doubts. Because if you start doubting your doubts, then you're back to knowing something for sure. Right? Have you guys ever thought about doubting your doubts? I doubt it. You have not. Come on. This is the big one. You ought not judge. We've talked about this before. What's the problem with it? It's judging, isn't it? That's what they're doing. They're judging you when they say you ought not judge. Of course it's a judgment. Now, by the way, did Jesus say don't judge? What did he say? This is from Matthew chapter 7, by the way. Judge not, lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, take the log out of your own eye first. Then you'll be better able to help your brother. Is Jesus telling us not to judge here? No, he's telling us to take the speck out of our brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. He's simply saying, get that problem out of your life first so then you can better help your brother. So this is not a command not to judge. It is a command on how to judge. In other words, don't judge hypocritically. If you've got that problem, get it out of your life first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. And Jesus sometimes judged people very harshly. You've heard this before, right? You've heard people say, well, that person's such a saint, they've never said a bad word about anyone. If that's the definition of a saint, Jesus was no saint. I just gave you a verse here about Jesus calling the Jews who believed in him, basically they're sons of the devil. In Matthew chapter 23, he's talking to the Pharisees, who were the political and religious leaders of Israel, and he says, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Oh, you look great on the outside, you're whitewashed tombs, but on the inside, you're full of dead men's bones. You go a mile to make a convert, and then once you make them a convert, you make them twice as much a son of hell as you are. How will you avoid being condemned to hell? Sweet and gentle Jesus said this? Yes, Jesus was not Barney, okay? Can we all just get along, boys and girls? No, he was not Mr. Rogers. He certainly didn't go around saying, this sermon brought to you by the letter E, okay? He was direct, and sometimes we need to be direct too. Because he was the truth, and he knew what the truth was. So you can't get away from truth. If you try and say that it doesn't exist, or that it's relative, or there are no absolute truths, or you can't know it, it's all self-defeating. Of course there's truth. So truth is not relative. Now, what is humanity's greatest problem? What do you think it is? Yeah, we are the problem. Well, let's take a look at what Augustine said here. Who do you believe? Check this quote out from Augustine, who lived about 400 A.D., one of the most quoted church theologians of all time. Here's what he said. If you believe what you like in the Gospels and reject what you don't like, it is not the Gospel you believe, but yourself. By the way, we could say that you could say that obviously here about the Bible. You could say it about our Constitution. You could say if you believe what you like in the Constitution and reject what you don't like, it's not the Constitution you believe, but yourself. Whatever you're talking about, right? Who do we believe? Do we believe ourselves or do we believe the gospel? Once we have evidence that the gospel is true, we ought to believe the gospel, right? Pascal said the same thing in a little bit different way. He said this: people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. Again, are people on a happiness quest or a truth quest? Most people are on a happiness quest. Whatever they find attractive, that's what they're going to go for. The lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the boastful pride of life. That's what we're going to go for. Hey, we all do that on occasion, don't we? And when you ask people, why do you believe that, and they can't give you an answer, you know why they can't give you an answer? Because it's not based on answers. It's based on what they like. They don't have reasons for it other than their own preferences. Now, if that's true of us, pity us, right? That's why Paul says, if Christ hasn't risen from the dead, your whole faith is in vain. In other words, we're saying this is really true. This really happened. Why believe it if it's not true? Here is the greatest problem. Romans chapter 1. We went through it last time we went through the book of Romans. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who do what? Suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Creation, God has given us evidence of Him through the effects that we call creation. The universe, life, those are all part of creation. Everything we see around us, part of creation. But the issue here is, our problem is that we suppress the truth. That's our greatest problem. Humanity's greatest problem is that we know the truth, but we don't like it, and so we suppress it. In fact, Jesus said this in another way in John chapter 3. He said, this is, of course, right after the famous passage, for God so loved the world. This is just a couple verses later. Here's what he says. For this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but men love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly that what he has done has been done through God. Men love darkness rather than light. That's our problem. We suppress the truth because we love darkness rather than light. We are truth seekers on one hand, but truth suppressors on the other hand. That's our problem. And we all know it in our hearts. We all do this. Paul, of course, in this context is talking about people who do it and ultimately lose all basic knowledge of God. By the time they get to end of Romans 1, they're not only doing evil things, they are actually encouraging and applauding others to do evil things as well, which is basically what's going on in our culture today. In our culture today, we are now actually calling evil good and good evil. And again, whose fault is that? It's our fault. Basically, our greatest problem is the same problem that Jack Nicholson made apparent to us. Remember? When Tom Cruise said to him, I want the truth. And what did Nicholson say? Oh, come on, you can do better than that. You can't handle it. We can't handle the truth. You know why? Because the truth convicts us. That's why we can't handle the truth. That's why we suppress it. We suppress the truth because it convicts us. And when we suppress the truth, we're suppressing God. In fact, who suppresses the truth? Betrayers suppress the truth. Here is Caravaggio, who is a great painter about 400 or so years ago. He's painting, this is Judas kissing Christ. And if you want to see great real-life kind of paintings of biblical scenes, just Google Caravaggio. In any event, atheists betray the truth when they suppress it. And Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 1. They suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Richard Dawkins, one of the most famous atheists in the world today, in a recent rally there in D.C., said, you know what? We ought to even stop arguing with people who believe in God. Don't argue with them at all. You know what we should do? We should just mock them. He doesn't even want to have an intellectual discussion. He just wants to mock us. To which Ravi Zacharias, a Christian apologist from Atlanta, originally from India, said, I agree with Richard Dawkins on that. You know what? In fact, I agree with it so much, I'm going to help him do it. I'm going to give him a plane ticket to Saudi Arabia, send him there, and have him start right there. You start mocking people who believe in God in Saudi Arabia and see how long how long you can last there. But think about that. And when you mentioned, when you go to college campuses, what kind of questions you get. You know what kind of questions I get? Sometimes a lot of hostile questions, and I'll stop and I'll ask them, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And on 3 occasions in the past 2 years, I've had people yell back at me, no! No. No. Wait. You claim to be an atheist, a beacon of reason. Never mind that reason doesn't exist if atheism's true, because we're just molecules in motion, right? We're not really thinking, we're reacting. But let's leave that aside. You claim to be an atheist, a beacon of reason, and I ask you if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? And you say no? Why are we even here? Why don't we just go have pizza? What's the point of this? Right? Why? Because they're not there to learn. They're there to make themselves feel better. To try and see if they can poke holes in the Christian worldview. They're there to try and suppress the truth. That's what they're there to do. So, atheists suppress the truth. Unfortunately, you know who else suppresses the truth? We do. We suppress the truth. I've had Christians, when I was an interim pastor, I've had people come up to me and say, God told me to leave my wife. Really? Yeah. Newsflash, if God told you to do something that's contrary to the Bible, it wasn't from God. Because the will of God is never contrary to the Word of God. The will of God is never contrary to the Word of God. But we suppress the truth. We suppress truth all the time. Unfortunately, we do. In fact, husbands and wives suppress the truth. We do in our relationships all the time. We suppress stuff we know is true, but we don't even want to bring it up, or we want to avoid it because it convicts us. And sometimes we suppress the truth when we say, oh, I don't love her anymore. I don't love him anymore. So I have a right now to be in love, of course, so I'm going to look for somebody else. Newsflash, love is not a feeling. In fact, if you look in 1 Corinthians 13, and by the way, everyone who's ever gotten married that has anything to do with Christianity has read 1 Corinthians 13 at their wedding, right? Love is patient, love is kind, love is not self-seeking, love is not rude, love is not boastful. You know it all. There's not one feeling in the whole chapter. What is it? It's all action. It's all behavioral. It's not a feeling at all. There is no way you could vow to feel the same way for the next 50 or 60 years on the day of your wedding. In fact, you wouldn't want that to continue. Could you imagine? Remember when you first met your wife, for those of you out there, your husband, whoever it is, and you got that infatuation period where your heart beat like a hummingbird all day and all you could think about was the other person? You'd be dead already if that feeling continued. You couldn't hold down a job. You couldn't do anything if that feeling continued. But people think when that feeling goes away, then love is over. No. Don't merely marry the one you love. Love the one you marry. The media suppresses the truth. 2 examples. I could give 100. Let me just give you 2 examples. Let's go back to the last election. Benghazi. All I need to say is this. If 4 Americans, how many SEALs were there? 1, 2? Called for help and were refused it, or there was some question as to whether or not they were refused it, 2 months before an election, and a Republican was president, what do you think the media would have done? They'd impeached him before the election. He'd have been crucified. He'd have been out the door already. Would they have allowed the sitting president to lie in the second debate about calling it a terror attack? Would the moderator in the debate jump in and try and rescue the president if he was a Republican? No, the media suppresses the truth all the time. 90% or so of them vote Democrat every time. Now, I'm not saying the Republicans are always true. Don't get me wrong. I'm simply saying it's not a level playing field. A couple months ago, there was a story that came out, page 1 of the New York Times. Fragment says Jesus had a wife. No mention of this in the Bible, of course. New York Times runs it on page 1. Some Harvard professor said, yeah, Jesus had a wife. A week later, it was revealed to be a forgery. Where did the New York Times run it? Not on page 1. Buried somewhere in the paper. And you know what it said? The headline said, Vatican says, fragment of forgery. As if, well, this is just a religious viewpoint. No, all the scholars were saying the same thing. When something calls into question Christianity, the media blasts it all over the place. When something actually isn't questioning Christianity or is countering something that previously did question Christianity, they bury it. Watch where you get your information from. And how about politicians? Well, of course. Politicians suppress the truth all the time, don't they? Let's just talk about what's going on right now. They're talking about taxes and tax rates and all this stuff. Do you know that if you confiscated all the money of everyone who made $1 million a year, you wouldn't even close the deficit for 1 year? If you just took all the money, this has nothing to do with tax rates. It's a spending problem. It's all spending. We are overspending in this country by $50,000 per second. That's not government spending. That's government overspending. That's a $1.6 trillion debt comes down to $50,000 every second in overspending. Overspending. This isn't a tax issue. Yet, that's what the politicians are trying to tell us. It's a tax issue. And they're also trying to tell us, by the way, what light bulbs to use, but they're not wanting to tell us to put any restrictions on killing our children when it comes to abortion. Remember when Jesus went after the Pharisees? He said, you neglect the weightier matters of the law. You're tithing your spices, but you're neglecting the weightier matters of the law. That's what we're doing here in this country. We're telling people what light bulbs to use, but we won't tell them not to kill their children. Politicians going on. President Obama went on TV and talked about, well, if we stop funding Planned Parenthood, then women won't be able to get cancer screenings. Newsflash, Planned Parenthood doesn't do cancer screenings. They do abortions. In fact, there was an organization that kept calling all the Planned Parenthood offices to say, hey, I want to schedule a mammogram. And every one of them said, we don't do mammograms, we don't do mammograms, we don't do mammograms. But the politicians will get up there and tell you they do. Why? Because they're suppressing the truth. In fact, you know, we've had this recent gun issue, the Kansas City Chiefs. Bob Costas goes on TV and says we need gun control. Turns out everywhere there's gun control, crime is up. Everywhere there isn't, crime is down, right? Well, we can suppress the truth about that, can't we? We all know that guns don't kill people. Planned Parenthood does. Why don't we ban them? We'll just suppress the truth about that, won't we? How about the private sector? It's not just the government that does this, it's not just politicians. Think about big business. Big businesses have media rooms and spin rooms, prospectuses, right? When they're trying to sell you, it's smoke and mirrors quite frequently, isn't it? They don't want the truth to get out because if the truth gets out, that's going to panic the market. It's all spin. Not all of it, but you get the idea. People suppress the truth. Almost everyone suppresses the truth. I found a very notable exception. You know what the notable exception is? The biblical writers don't suppress the truth because they record one embarrassing detail after another. Do you notice that? In fact, in our book, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, we have a whole section on this. All the embarrassing details in the Bible would never be admitted if they were making this story up. Who would make up that, here's Peter denying Christ? Who would make up that their main leader denied Christ 3 times after saying he never would? Who would have made up, by the way, that they all ran away at the crucifixion event? And the brave ones were who? The women. Who would have made that up? Who wrote this down? Men. Men wrote this down. Now, what man is going to say that he was hiding for fear of the Jews while the women went down and discovered the empty tomb. Would any man in here say that? No, there's no man who would say that. In fact, if I was making up the resurrection story, I would have said something like, let's see, we marched right down there and overpowered that elite Roman guard. Yeah, that sounds good. And then we saw Jesus, who congratulated us on our great faith. And then we went and comforted the trembling women. There is no way we would say that we were hiding for fear of the Jews. We would no way we would say that we were Mr. Sissy Pants while the women were the brave ones. Wouldn't happen. Yet the entire Old Testament and the New Testament has embarrassing detail after embarrassing detail in it, which shows me they weren't like a politician or a business media spin room. They were just telling the truth. Oh, by the way, why would you never have the women be the witnesses if you're making up the resurrection story? The first witnesses. Why? Because in that culture, a woman's testimony was not considered on par with that of a man. So if you're making up the New Testament resurrection story, the women aren't even involved. Yet all four Gospels say the women were the first witnesses. Why? Because they were. This is not a made-up story. And they wouldn't doubt either. Notice they doubt at the crucifixion, or I'm sorry, at the ascension. In Matthew chapter 28, verse 17, they're standing there. He's given them the Great Commission, and they're doubting. They're doubting it's him. Think they would have made that up? No way. Yes, we suppress the truth, but I notice that the Bible writers don't seem to do that. They just kind of tell the truth. And another piece of evidence is, by telling the truth, what happened to them? They got excommunicated from the synagogue, because remember, they were Jews. Then they got beaten, tortured, and killed. Last time I checked, that was not a list of perks, right? Hey, we're going to make up a new religion. We are? Yeah, what's it going to get us? It's going to get us excommunicated, then beaten, tortured, and killed. Well, sign me up. You know, why haven't we thought of this earlier? What a great idea. No, this is not a made-up story. It doesn't have the spin in it. It's just the truth. If God is truth, how should we live? Remember last time we were here, we talked about what's the primary reason people feel stress and worry. What is the primary reason? Do you remember this? There's a couple of sessions ago. Yes, the primary reason is uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. The primary reason markets get spooked is because of uncertainty. The primary reason businesses don't do things is because of uncertainty. The primary reason we worry in our personal lives is because of uncertainty. We don't know what's coming down next. God's word is eternal. Jesus, in Matthew 24, giving his Olivet Discourse, says, "Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away." Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. You want something certain? Then go with God's words. Don't go with what you believe about God's words. Some you believe, some you don't. Just go with God's words. Here's another Caravaggio. This is Peter being crucified upside down because he said, I'm not qualified, or I'm not worthy to be killed in the manner my Lord was killed in. So if you're going to crucify me upside down. Now, here's what he writes in 1 Peter, a real book about suffering. He says, all men are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord stands forever. Imagine that. He knows he's dead. He probably knew he was going to be assassinated, executed. But he still says, I'm gone, I'm going to wither, but the words of the Lord stand forever. Which is why that we have to study to correctly handle the word of truth. Paul says in his last book, the last one he wrote, 2 Timothy, to Timothy, he says, do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who does not need to be ashamed and who correctly handles the word of truth. The word of truth. If we're going to be tethered to truth, if we're going to be tethered to God, we've got to know God's word. That's why we have to study. That's why we get together. That's why we do these things. We're going to wither, but God's words won't. And let's go back to our question. Are you on a happiness quest or a truth quest? Well, let me ask the question a different way. What if ultimate happiness can only be found by finding and living the truth? What if ultimate happiness can only be found by finding and living the truth? You know what? I think that's true. No pun intended. In fact, that's exactly what the Scriptures say. Paul is in prison in Rome. He knows he's going to be executed. Here's a Rembrandt. Paul in prison in Rome. In Philippians chapter 4, here's what he says. I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. There's a difference between happiness in our common understanding of it and contentment. Hey, I'm not happy when I'm in pain. You're not happy either. But you might be content, right? You might know that your life is going in the right direction. You can be content with your direction, even if your personal, immediate circumstances might be painful. So where are you now? What is the direction of your life? Are you content with your direction? Are you content with seeking the Lord? Are you seeking the Lord? Augustine said it well so many years ago. Our Lord, you have created us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. Ultimate happiness, ultimate contentment can only be found by knowing God and making him known. And he is the source of all truth. And oh, by the way, as we mentioned before, that all these attributes are connected, even though we perceive them individually. Think about this, that all of God's attributes depend on God being truth. Because if he's not truth, then it's not true that he has power, it's not true that he has knowledge, it's not true that he has any of the other attributes, right? So truth describes all these other attributes. God is the ultimate source of truth. And that's what we're made for, to know him. And of course, to make him known. All right, what's the summary? What is the truth and how does it relate to God? The truth is fidelity to original or a standard. God is the standard. Christ was an exact representation of that standard. Isn't truth relative? No, it's absolute. It's self-defeating to say it's relative, actually. What is humanity's greatest problem? We suppress the truth because we want to go our own way, because we love darkness rather than light. And we think we're going to be happy if we try and do things our way, when the truth of the matter is, ultimately, we're only going to be content, we're only going to be happy, ultimately, if we follow the truth and find it. And that's the answer to the question, if God is truth, how should we live? We should seek God. We should know him and make him known.
The preceding program was brought to you by crossexamined.org.
Hi, my name is Joanna Jowett and I play Kelly Abernathy on the TV series 7th Street Theater, and we air every week on the NRB network. I hope you'll join us.
Saturday on NRB TV.
Discover the Truth with John MacArthur.
Sunday on NRB TV.